Hello and welcome to Ways to Change the World. I'm Krishnan Guru-Murthy, and this is the podcast in which we talk to extraordinary people about the big ideas in their lives and the events that have helped shape them. My guest this week is in one of the big event dramas of 2023, but he is one of our greatest British actors and sort of an export because he's huge in Hollywood too and has worked with all the greats. But his story is fascinating because of where he comes from, and his enduring links to where he comes from and his strong beliefs and his strong ethics. Eddie Marsan, welcome. Thank you very much indeed for coming in. So The Power is a show I feel we're going to be talking about quite a bit for a long time, because this is a book that's caused a huge amount of conversation, and now it's this TV event. I got to be careful not to do spoilers, but so you tell us what it's about and what we should know before watching it.
Well, it was written in 2016 by Naomi Alderman. It was a New York Times bestseller. President Obama said it was his favorite book at the time. And it's a story about teenage girls suddenly develop the power to create electricity in their hands through this thing called a skein, which is a new organ that they develop. And they pass it on to older women as well. So women suddenly become physically more powerful than men. So the whole gender power dynamic changes in the world. And it's not really a film about the world will be better because women have the power. It's about the aspect of power. It's about a study of power, really. It's about how power corrupts and the good you can do and the harm you can do, really. It provokes fascinating discussion within the cast and within the writers. It's a really thought-provoking drama.
And this is a female-dominated production, isn't it?
Yes, all the writers, directors, and producers are female. And it was great for me because when they came in and asked me, the character I played, Bernie Monk, was in the original book, and Naomi had written this character. Naomi's Jewish. I'm not Jewish, but the character is a Jewish gangster. And when she wrote it for me, I said, can you help me? She said, I'm going to give you all the information. Her father went into the writer's room and talked to the writers. She gave me a load of family photographs. She created this great family history of Bernie Monk. And then she said to me, one of the things I want you to think, the relationship between Bernie Monk and Roxy, his illegitimate daughter, who develops the most power of any woman in the world. Think of it as being like Henry VIII and Elizabeth I. And it was such a great metaphor for me to find a hook into playing the character. We've got to do something special for your 18th.
Are you going to hire me the ballroom, Daddy?
That's enough, Rose.
There is one thing that I want.
What's that, dog?
I want to work for you.
So what difference did it make having such a sort of a female-dominated production creatively for you?
I did 7 seasons of Ray Donovan, and there was one season where we had mainly female directors because it was a more introspective season. It was when Abby died of cancer, and it was a more introspective season. And I really enjoyed that because whenever you play an alpha male character, but it's written and directed from a female perspective, I always find that more aware. It's a more honest portrayal. Men aren't that honest about their own toxicity, really. So to play Bernie, who's the expression of toxic masculinity, but to know that it's actually the testimony of women, of female writers and directors, was for me creatively really inspiring. I found that really interesting.
What do you mean by toxic masculinity?
I think it's the idea. It's basically a fear that you will be rejected, a fear that you are powerless, and so you are prepared to do immoral things to maintain power, to maintain love.
Because you play a lot of sort of unlikable characters.
Yes. Yeah.
Bad guys.
Yes.
And in real life, you're
I'm just normal.
You're just normal. So you're not a swaggering guy.
No.
Why do you think these characters come to you?
I think it's a lot to do with the way I look. I think it's a lot to do with my upbringing. where I come from, because I come from the East End. A lot of those characters, a lot of people have a fixed idea about people from that place.
Do you mean casting agents?
Casting agents, they do.
They think, he'll understand.
Yeah. And to a certain extent, I do, because there was a lot of violence when I was a kid, and there was a lot of criminality, and there was a lot of toxic masculinity. The estate where I was raised, most of the fathers had court orders not to come near the house. So me and the other boys that I grew up with, if you saw somebody's father, you didn't run and give him a cuddle. You went and told the mum to phone the police because the dad's coming. So we had lots of experience of that. It was the beginning of women's lib. Women were beginning to divorce husbands who were treating them bad. And 20, 30 years earlier, they didn't divorce them. They just stuck it out. And then they began to, and so men began to feel like their power was being taken away. And that's why then they turned to violence, and that's why they had court orders.
Do you remember being afraid of men as a young boy?
I remember being afraid of white working class men, because it's very interesting. Because I come from Bethnal Green, but there's other actors from the same background, like Danny Dyer or Ray Winstone, who are much more successful in portraying and much more charismatic in portraying those men. I mean, when you see Danny Dyer, Ray Winstone, they have a kind of appeal to them. And I've never been able to do that. And it's because my experience of growing up within the white working class was always an element of fear. I always felt very vulnerable because of an element of violence and alcohol. And it was actually a St. Lucian family that gave me a kind of refuge that took me in, as it were.
In what circumstances? How did that happen?
Well, Mrs. Mitchell, I call her mum. She lived along the landing, and I used to go to her. She had 5 children, and her sons they become brothers. Mrs. Mitchell was mum to me, and they became like brothers. And she would just let me come in the house, give me food, and I would sit and listen to records and learn how to dance and read comics. And she kind of gave me an unconditional love, really. And so, and my mum knew she was doing this. My mum was a fantastic mum, but she had her hands full in a very difficult marriage. So I would go to Mrs. Mitchell's house and sit with the family and eat and dance and just kind of, and what it did to me is it made me reject the initial orthodoxy that I was born into, that white working class. Yeah. And it ignited in me a kind of curiosity. I rejected an element of myself that made me feel vulnerable. I never felt safe. I always felt safer with Mrs. Mitchell and the family. So that's probably one of the reasons why whenever I portray someone from that background, I'm never Del Boy. Yeah. I'm always Bernie Monk.
And so I suppose when you compare it to other actors,
yes,
who have that swagger and charisma around those kind of characters, there's a sexiness to it.
There's a sexiness to it, and I never have that.
But is that because I presume you can do sexy? Well, you can do sexy because of your part in Ray Donovan.
Yes.
But are you saying you choose not to portray, or
no.
you just couldn't do it?
No, it's not that. I tell you what happened to me. When my parents divorced when I was 16 after a very difficult marriage, for a period of time, I became a born-again Christian, and then I gave that up. So and then when I became an actor, when I went to drama school, they were teaching me how to breathe deeply in order to fill my voice to fill a theatre. And in Bethnal Green, there was a Buddhist centre, and I went to a Buddhist centre at Bethnal Green just to do breathing technique. And inadvertently, I ended up going to meditation classes. And then I went to meditation classes and I started to go to Buddhist lectures there as well. So at drama school, I was studying the Stanislavski method of creating a character. And then at the same time, in the evening, I was going to these Buddhist lectures. And the first noble truth of Buddhism is that life is suffering. But one of the main causes of suffering is the idea that we have a fixed self. We have a self that's eternal. And we can never change. And the Buddha says that's not true. And he came up with this idea of this thing called an Atman, which is no self. And that really appealed to me, the idea of an Atman, the idea of having no self. And I began to meditate and study acting as well as study the idea of the self. And I realized that when I held on to my idea of a self, which was a caricature of myself, which was a caricature of a white East End self, it was because it was a protection against trauma. And then I began to realize that most human beings, whenever we hold on to an idea of ourselves, it's to deal with trauma in some way. And the truth is, there is no self. It's not that we don't exist, but we don't exist as a fixed thing. We're part of a fluid, ever-changing consciousness, really.
Without wishing to pry.
No, please.
What was the trauma?
It was my parents' marriage, really. And not only my parents' marriage, it was violence within the area. I worked in a pub from the age of 13 to the age of 16. So I left school at 15. And you would see violence all the time. I remember being in the pub and there were two women were having an argument, one barmaid and one woman, and the other woman just came across the bar. The pub was closing up and the other woman just walked across and picked up a glass and smashed it in her face. You saw things like that all the time. You would see violence. My father would get into fights all the time, and you would see fights in pubs and things. And my black friends, we once came out of a club in Hackney, me and a black friend of mine, Raymond, and a car came out of a car park and pulled up behind him, wound down the back window, grabbed his jumper and shouted out, "You black bastard," and just drove off and dragged him. And I drunkenly, not bravely, but grabbed his feet, and we ended up both getting dragged along a dual carriageway. And then they let us go and we bounced. And I remember messing up my knee and had to go to my mate's house because I couldn't go home to my mum to let her know because she would have worried. So there was lots of that. There was lots of inarticulacy and violence.
So it's pretty unusual to be in that setting with that background and to be attending Buddhist lectures and getting into acting. So what happened? How did that happen?
I think because my father would have parties when I was a kid, and lots of men would talk about those black bastards, and there was a lot of racism, and I knew that the people they were talking about were actually loving me and giving me refuge from them. So I already began to question the idea of identity, of myself. What am I? What am I here? I don't buy this. I don't buy this image that I'm supposed to be, this culture that I'm supposed to buy into. That's not what I am. And my friends, all the kids in our estate, because of our fathers, we all lived under a certain amount of chaos. So all of us have done pretty well. All of us have become artists, or another friend of mine, David Hermit, run an educational trust in Chester. And now he advises the government on racism in schools. So lots of us were born in poverty and chaos. And in order to have our own volition and autonomy, we became ambitious. We aspired to something and we achieved something. So I'm not the exception. I'm quite the norm amongst my peers.
But do you think that is normal or was normal? Or were you an unusual?
No, I
cohort?
don't. Mrs. Mitchell had a son called Alan who died a couple of years ago, and he used to read. He was mad about it. He became a graphic artist he used to write graphic novels, and he became a writer. And he ignited in us this curiosity to read. So we used to read a lot when I was a kid. We used to read comics and things. But then I ended up leaving school at 15 with no qualifications because within the white working class community, there was never any value in education. There was no point. I remember saying to my dad, I might stay on and do A-levels. And he said, no, you're going out and getting a job. And I was in a wood factory at 15, working in a wood factory. So there was never any value in education.
What was your dream at that stage then?
I didn't know what it was. I just wanted to work out what was going on. I was a bit lost. There was no moral center within my family. There was no kind of, I had no examples. And then I ended up working for a man called Mr. Bennett in a menswear store. And he was a bookmaker, but he ran a menswear store, and I worked for him. And then he knew that I was lost. And he said to me, well, what happened was me and Emmanuel, Mrs. Mitchell's third son, we used to dance. We used to be very good dancers. We were asked to be extras on a film set. And then I was on a film set and I saw the actor Jamie Foreman, who's now a friend of mine. And he did this brilliant scene where he had to walk across a dance floor. And it was so brilliant. I remember thinking, I want to do that. And so I said, I want to be an actor. And then when I was working for Mr. Bennett, he knew that I wasn't in a good place. And he said, what do you want to do with your life? Because I was serving an apprenticeship as a printer, but I wasn't happy. And I said, well, I want to be an actor. And he said, well, if you get into drama school, I'll pay the fees. And he did. And he did. And it took me about 3 years to get into drama school. I got rejected every year. And then eventually I got in. And he paid the fees.
What kept you going through the rejection for a couple of years?
I had no choice, really, because there was nothing else that I could do. I couldn't go back to that way of life that I had. I never felt safe. When I first started acting and creating and working on creating the characters, I realized that in the creation of a character, actually, the metaphor that I discovered was very similar to me as a person. And the way I describe it is it's like being in a room that's filling up with water. There's no doors, no windows, and it's filling up with water. And suddenly the water gets to a level where you think you can't breathe and you start to panic because you're reaching a level where you're gonna die. And then suddenly the walls collapse and you're in a room twice as big. And you take, oh, thank God for that. And then suddenly your consciousness is bigger. But then the water starts to rise again. You get to a point where you're panicking, and then the walls collapse again. And as an actor, any actor will tell you that creating a character is like that. But in life, for me, it was like that. It was, I always felt this anxiety, like the water was rising, and then I had to hope that the walls would collapse and my perspective would change, and it did.
And so becoming an actor for you was actually part of building your own identity and character.
It was a necessity. It was when I heard that idea, the concept of enactment, that was like a lifesaver for me. When I was at drama school, I was the only boy in drama school from a council estate in my year. And there was a lovely young man, a good friend of mine called Jason, and he gave me the book called The Tao Te Ching by Lao Tzu, a book on Taoism. And in the Tao Te Ching, there was a passage that said to find self, lose self. And I was already going to the Buddhist center, and I thought, God, that's it. To find self, lose self. And, that's when I began to realize about the idea that my identity isn't fixed. One of the things about acting that I've struggled with within my career is being defined, people defining me. And it's been one of the hindrances to my career because no one's ever been able to market me and go, well, he's this or he's that or he's that, I've never been marketable. And I've always disappeared into the parts that I play. So there's no charisma there. That's me. Do you know what I mean? I'm always playing these other people. But the idea of an expanding, ever-changing self is what saved me, really.
You've referred a few times to being part of the white working class.
Yes.
It's not that simple, though, is it?
No. Because we found some guy contacted me a few years ago and said, I think we're related. And I met him in a pub in Romford, and he opened up this suitcase. And what we found out was his grandmother was my grandfather's sister. Now, my name is Marsan, and I'm from the East End. So I thought I was probably a Huguenot, because if you're French and from the East End, you must be a Huguenot. But I knew that my father's Catholic. I was born Catholic. So I kind of thought, I don't know what's going on there. And then he opened up this suitcase, and we found my great-grandfather's papers. And he was born in the port of Spain. He was from Trinidad. And there was a photograph of a woman, mixed race, beautiful, very elegant. She looked like she had money. And the back of the photograph had the word Mama. And he came over, his name was Clement Marsan, and he came over to the East End in 1900. And my father remembers him not speaking English, only speaking French. And my grandfather would speak French to his father and English to my father. And yet within a generation, we'd become this white working class stuckers.
So was he black or was he?
No, he was white.
Right.
But my father remembers just after the war having to go in to meet cousins and went to a train station and they were black. And he couldn't work out. And they gave him, the thing he remembers most is that they gave him half a crown. And then subsequently we found letters from relatives saying, I'm sorry I missed you when you came over. So it's all a big mystery.
I mean, this whole sort of question of identity is really interesting with parts you play as well, isn't
Yes.
it? Because you play Jewish parts,
Yes.
Disabled parts.
Yes.
And all of these things are up for negotiation now.
Yes.
They're all matters of debate.
Yes.
Are you appropriating other people's culture? Should you be allowed to play? Should you be allowed to play a Jewish role?
Yes.
What's your view on that? Is acting?
I think the main ethos of acting that I've always lived by is there was a playwright in the Roman era called Terence, a North African playwright, who said that nothing human is alien to me. The place where we want to get to is a place where any actor can play anything. That's the place where we've got to get to. Now, I did a film 2 years ago called Choose or Die, and there was a young trans actor playing my son. Now, the character wasn't written as trans. He didn't play the parts trans. He played my son, but he was brilliant. And if you look at gay actors, I understand what Russell T Davies said, but for my mind, the way, if you define a young actor, you do them a great disservice. If you define a young actor as a gay actor, or you define him as a Jewish actor, or you define him as a working class actor or a posh actor, you pigeonhole them and you affect their ability to earn a living and have a career. So I think with regards to Russell T Davies, and I think he's a brilliant writer. I don't know if he said what he said. I don't know if it was misquoted or what, but I think the best thing that you can do for that cast of It's a Sin is to take the lead, who I thought was a brilliant actor, then cast him in a straight part and say, watch how brilliant he is. And what you do is you challenge the prejudice of the audience. Because one of the reasons why there's been a reluctance to cast from minorities or to cast gay actors in straight roles is because producers, because there's so much money on the line, they're loath to challenge the subconscious prejudice within the audience. Well, that's what you have to challenge. So you get an openly gay actor and you cast him in a straight role. You look at Russell Tovey, you look at Con O'Neill, you look at, you look at those two actors, they're brilliant actors. That's the example that you follow. The young trans actor who was playing my son was brilliant. That's what you do. I don't care whether he's trans, he can play anything. I can understand that in order to do that, you have to challenge systemic bias. So there will be less opportunities for trans actors. So therefore you have to find a way to compensate for that, to give them an opportunity. And you have to, a lot of Jewish actors, I know the Jewish actors I work with, the interesting thing is whenever I work with them, it's always an ensemble. And usually I'm the only non-Jewish actor there. And when I'm working with them, they have no problem with me playing a Jewish actor. The problem is that when someone's casting something else, they never get put up for it because people think they're too Jewish. That's what I think they've got to challenge. You've got to challenge that. You mustn't define people.
And disabled actors.
I think disabled actors, they should play disabled parts if they can. I mean, when I play Terry Donovan, the problem is, what is the essence of the character? Terry Donovan had pugilistic Parkinson's, had been a boxer for 30 years, was sexually abused by priests. So what element of the character is the most important? Are you going to find someone who's been a boxer for 30 years, developed Parkinson's and was sexually abused are you going to find that person? No. So what do? You find someone who has the imagination and technique to create that, who then goes to talk to doctors and Parkinson's sufferers and talks about the symptoms and talks about the side effects of the medicine. And you carefully do that. I don't think acting is about who does it. I think it's about how they do it. And I think that's what we've got to try and get to.
And you say it's about, the filmmakers sort of trying to break the bias of the audience.
Yes.
Is it that, or is it the bias of the industry?
I don't think an openly gay actor has won a leading actor Oscar. I don't think an openly gay actor has. And I think that is because the industry are frightened of challenging the prejudice of the audience. It's why Kirk Douglas had to change his name. He couldn't have his Jewish name. He had to disappear. And that's what you have to challenge. Unless you challenge that, you'll never solve the problem.
How do you think that's changed during the course of your career?
Now?
Is it a slow change, or is it?
No, I think post Me Too and post Black Lives Matter, I think it's changed. I recently did a thing for Rap Man called Supercell, which is the series about the black members of the black community who have sickle cells suddenly developing superpowers. And it was such a thrill to be with him, this young London Nigerian rapper who's an absolute artist. I mean, he's a genius. And there was most of a black crew, black producers, and we had such a laugh. And it was a feeling like, they've arrived. And then, and I was so honored that they included me. I mean, I'm playing the old white racist fan, but I was so honored that they included me within that creative circle. To me, it was brilliant.
But what I mean is, how long do you think before we will see a openly gay actor winning an Oscar?
I think it will come soon. I don't know how long. Within the next few years, I think it will come. But it's very interesting. The more that we're trying to, I've been reading this book by a brilliant book by this man called Ibram X. Kendi, and it's a fantastic book about his term that we are all racist to a certain extent because we all buy into the concept of race. And he says it's such a pejorative term now, and actually it shouldn't be a pejorative term. It should be a descriptive term. Because if you describe it as a descriptive term, then you can bring it out. You can bring the subconscious to the conscious and discuss it, And I think the problem is we're trying to deal with inequalities, which I think we have to deal with. But they don't understand acting. The worst thing you can do for a young actor, especially a young actor from a minority, look, if you're a young actor from a privileged background, you can be mediocre and have a career. If you're a young kid from Streatham, born of Nigerian parents, you have to be exceptional to have any chance of a career. Now, if you say to that kid, you can only play Nigerian parts, he can't be exceptional. He can't be. But if you say to him, go to the RSC and play Henry V, and I want you to play Richard III, or then he can be exceptional. Then he can have a career as an actor.
Did you ever get to repay Mr. Bennett?
He was the best man at my wedding, although he had a stroke the night before. And he had a stroke the night before my wedding, and I had to drive. It was in Italy, and I had to drive to this hospital with his wife. And he'd collapsed and smashed in the side of his face. And a doctor came and said, we're going to put a plate in his face and his heart's okay. We think he can survive the operation, but we're going to have to operate now. And I was sitting there and with his wife, and they wheeled him in on a trolley. And I was thinking, oh, God, this is the worst night before my wedding ever. And then he just suddenly sat up and went, Eddie, I'll do anything to get out and making a speech. But he had that kind of humor, He was he was like my father, really.
What about your life now in terms of your links to your roots and where you live? I mean, you live in leafy West London.
Yes.
It's a very white area. It's affluent. It's a long way from what you grew up in.
Yes.
What is your enduring link to where you grew up?
The Mitchell family, really. I go back and I see them. I go back to see other people on the estate. If my next door neighbor died recently, Mrs. Barnett. She was Spanish. Her husband was Jamaican, and I gave the eulogy at at the funeral. They always joke that I'm the one who gives the eulogy. Somebody else, if the washing machine breaks down, you go and call someone. But if someone dies, Eddie will do a eulogy. I'm the one. So I turn up, and there's a great cafe in Bethnal Green, Polici's. I go back to Polici's all the time. When my mum was dying of cancer in Basingstoke, I used to drive through Bethnal Green, and if things were getting bad, I'd stop at Polici's, and they'd open up early and let me sit in there and gather my thoughts. So I still have very, very strong connections to that area and to that community. Yeah.
And I know you're a political person. Are your politics formed by where you came from?
Yes, they are. They're also formed by an aversion to dogma, really. When I became a born-again Christian, when I was 16, I bought into a very binary interpretation of Christianity, where the preacher, there's one point, the breaking point for me was when the preacher said, we're going to go to Leicester Square to save homosexuals. And I remember thinking, save them from what? I don't know what we're going to save them. And I remember pulling out of it, but I had a kind of nervous breakdown about the age of 16. So I've always...
Would have been saving them from the police in those days.
Probably.
It was illegal.
Yeah. So probably it was that. It was an aversion to a binary way of thinking. So if you describe me politically, I would say I'm a social democrat. I'm not a socialist, but I'm a social democrat. I believe in redistribution of wealth so that people like me have a chance to become successful. And that means that people like me have to pay more taxes. I don't mind that.
And are you involved politically now at all?
No, not really. I'll tell you what happened. It was immediate. The two things happened. It was Brexit, and I campaigned for a people's vote, a second referendum, and the anti-Semitism. Those two things were immediate. So, and now they're not as immediate as Keir Starmer is making changes within the Labour Party. Brexit is kind of unraveling now. And that's...
Do you think so?
I think so. I think within 5 to 10 years, people will be thinking, I think eventually we'll go back into the single market and the customs union. And then people will say, what's the point? Why aren't we at the table influencing things? And now I can have the luxury of letting my work, my work is much more intelligent than I am, because it's a collaborative art form. So there's much more intelligent writers and other actors and directors. So I can choose things. But the issues that interest me, I can now choose to make films about rather than just argue on social media.
But do you think there is much politics in film and TV at the moment?
I don't know. I mean, when we did Ridley Road, Sarah Soleimani asked me to do it because she said it's a more persuasive way of challenging anti-Semitism than arguing with the far right or the far left. I think there are. I think the power is a really, really good way of provoking discussion. And discussion's always good. And I think I just did a film called Fair Play, which was a big success at the Sundance Film Festival, which is about a young couple who were both working a hedge fund, and the young man thinks he's gonna get the promotion, and the young woman gets the promotion, and their relationship unravels. And I think films like that are fantastic because that's a really creative way of having those discussions.
Do you think the power, without giving too much away, plays into that idea though of actually they're all the same? That if you look at a power switch, you end up with the same problems?
Well, Naomi said that the interesting thing about power is that power uses you. People think they can use power, but power uses you. So I think that's why I'm not a big believer in any political system, in capitalism or communism. They're only as good as the virtue of the people who are operating it. If you have corrupt people in a democratic monarchy, in capitalism, if you have to corrupt people in communism, they'll corrupt the system. So really, it's about us. It's about us and our own morality. So I'm not great fan of political systems or ideologies or religions.
And for you personally, do you want to write, direct,
yes, I
all
do.
Of those things?
Yes, eventually. I mean, I've got 4 children, and my youngest is now 12. My oldest is 18. So I think once I get them through the teenage years, the navigation of that, and the last one's at university, I think I'll probably direct and write. I mean, I've already written. I've written something that the Carnival and NBC in America have purchased. So they now own something that I wrote. So I've written something and successfully sold it. I can't say what it is, but it's, I do enjoy that. I enjoy that. And what was interesting was when I sat down to do it, I started doing it when I was flying. I used to commute. When I did Ray Donovan, I'd fly back and forth because my family lived in London, and I would fly back. And I couldn't watch any more movies on a plane. It was driving me mad. And I just started writing. And then I used to have 12-hour plane journeys and just write. And I suddenly found that I could do it because I read about 3 scripts a week.
How difficult is it to run your life doing what you're doing? I mean, the last time we met, we were in Paris.
Yes.
We were meeting your wife.
Yes.
Who had finished doing a charity bike ride I founded called the Duchenne Dash. And, you know, you were telling me about how much time you were spending in America. And
yes.
It's an odd existence, isn't it? You know,
it is.
I mean, I travel, but I travel short periods of time.
Yeah. And
I come back. When you travel, you can be away for quite a long time.
I'm never away for like, even if I have we have a rule about 2-week rule. So even if I'm off for a day, I'll fly back home. I'll fly back home if it's only for a day. And what I found is that I would fly back and be home at weekends. Now, some weekends, some days Ray Donovan didn't need me till Tuesday or Wednesday, but sometimes they needed me on a Monday morning. So I would literally arrive on a Saturday afternoon and fly back on a Sunday afternoon. But for Daddy to be there for the kids was priceless. Yeah. Just to be there, even if Daddy's worn out.
Can your environmental conscience sort of carry on doing that, do you think?
Well, I had to my priority was my family.
Was your family?
Yeah, I had to.
Yeah.
I had to. Yeah.
And if you could change the world in any way, how would you change it?
I think that analogy I gave you about the walls collapsing, I think we have to, I would try to create a world where people can transcend the idea of themselves. That's what I want. If you can transcend the idea of yourselves and open up to other opinions and other cultures, you realize that if there's no self, there's just one self.
So give us the tips then. Is there a method?
I meditate.
What do you do?
I meditate. If people just meditate every day, I think the world would be a lot better.
And when you meditate, do you mean literally meditating on one phrase?
No, I do mindfulness of breathing. But I've tried other techniques, but I do mindfulness of breathing. So I just sit there and watch my breath for 20 minutes.
And then as a byproduct of that, the walls come down.
Yes, because what happens is you become detached from, look, we have about 50,000 thoughts every day, 40,000 of which we had the day before. And what meditation does is it enables you to step back. So rather than just be this continuing process of thoughts and thoughts and thoughts, you just step back and think, hold on, how useful are these? Are they accurate? And that's what I try and do is work out how accurate they are. Sometimes I do it. Sometimes I'm back on the cycle again. So I have to keep trying to detach myself.
Eddie Marsan, thank you very much.
Thank you very much. Thank you.
That was great. Thank you very much.